So the colonization of America begins with Henry VIII of England and his separation from the Catholic Church. His separation has to do with his wife for two reasons. The first reason is that the church wants to control or contain the Protestants that have emerged here in northern Germany. The Pope's idea is to strengthen Spain's position with the Holy Roman Empire and strengthen Spain's position with a marriage with Catherine of Aragon here with Great Britain. From King Henry VIII's point of view, it gave Spain too much power. And the second reason why he wanted to divorce his wife was the fact that she wasn't giving him a male heir. So, in effect, not being able to get an annulment from the Pope because of the more for the reasons of the treaty than it does for the idea of him getting a new wife, he decided to separate from the church and create his own church. Um, he wasn't much a theological man. He admired Luther, but he didn't necessarily follow along his religious convictions. But he did indeed create the Anglican Church, which is separate from the church in Rome. Just like many other princes here in Germany, many of the nobles like the idea of money being stayed here in England, and the tax is not going to Rome just because they're Catholic. We call them teeths or tithes. So his daughter eventually, after King Henry VIII dies, his daughter becomes a new queen. She decides not to get married. Instead, they create what we call a functional constitutional monarchy. We wouldn't call this an official constitutional monarchy, but we know for sure that her position as a monarch is now dependent on the laws governed by the parliament. So nobles are split here in England. Some of them are Catholic, some of them wanted to remain with Catholicism, but others are now seeing this as an opportunity to weaken the position of the monarchy and allow for their laws to start to push forward into the modern world. And this is really about modernism, moving forward into this new concept of capitalism. Another thing that they like the idea coming from Martin Luther is the idea of salvation coming from faith and not through works, and also this opening of usury, what we call bankery, or banking, I'm sorry, of opening the door to capitalism. We find the Dutch moving forward on capitalism, and so under Elizabeth, many of the nobles here that are pushing for a new economy, pushing for greater, their eyes are really set on England. They push for the building of not only a merchant marine class shipping and industry, but they're also looking for establishing a strong navy and pushing for a global reach into the new world and establishing a new type of economic future for Great Britain. So for many British and English, mostly English, they like this idea of a less stronger monarch and a parliamentary-led government. So she cannot necessarily pass laws unless it's given to them by these parliament men. And these parliament men like the idea of establishing a new type of economy that isn't tied to the Middle Ages and feudal lords and agriculture. This is going to be an industry, shipping, colonial type of industry, type of economy for Great Britain. And their first sites are going to be on on Ireland, conquering Ireland and establishing control over Ireland. This is going to be their first colony under this new type of freedom from the Pope. So the English are moving to a new type of economy. They are driven by national glory uh, in rivalry of France and Spain. Profit. Now individuals are banking and investing, and they feel free to move forward into a new modern world. There's also a missionary zeal. They want to limit the expansion of Catholicism in the New World, and so they began to invest in exploring the New World and eventually settling here in Jamestown and making other settlements along the new colonies. But before that, I'd like to make a little quick explanation of this new economy that includes enclosure. And to understand the concept of enclosure over here, we have to look back a little bit in the Middle Ages and look at the manorial system. In the manorial system, everyone here in the village who are peasants have a work or some kind of job to do in which they support the noble. But in doing so, they also have food and supplies for themselves within the village where they can live off of. In this new type of economy and this new modern world that England is moving forward to, they're looking at and expanding into international markets. So what the lords are now doing is they're transforming their land from a manorial system to what we call enclosure. So no longer are they needing peasants; they're using the land for a specific type of industry. In this case, you could be sheep raising, and so forth. So without the peasants needed, the peasants are moving to the cities and crowding the cities and becoming uh, problems in London of being poor. Some of them are being helped to use a war against Ireland, but eventually you have a large number of poor that the English basically want to get rid of and move them to a new location. And so one of the interesting things about enclosure and private property is this is a new concept with capitalism that is going to spread around the world. For most people who are not involved in this type of industry, and this is one of the critiques that the church had mentioned, is that when private property is used for profit, individuals are now find themselves poor and without having the ability to sustain themselves. And they find themselves in cities and unwanted without any jobs and so forth. So poverty in this new capitalist society is different from the poverty before of trying to use the land the most they can before there's a bad harvest, or the fact that they had to feed the Lord first. That was a kind of poverty before. The new type of poverty is an unusefulness of not finding a job because private property has secured most of the income of that property. So one of the reasons why a lot of people are migrating to the new world is because of the stress of being able to feed themselves in this new property-driven type of economy. So now with the ability to establish investments in banking, a company had been given the right to invest and find gold in Jamestown. And these initial settlements here in Jamestown were looking for gold and didn't find it. They didn't have the ability to structure themselves without nobles. They were just pretty much families and men, mostly men, who found it very difficult to work for each other, as it seemed to be like labor now in this new context meant servitude. So they couldn't necessarily work together to the point where they're actually starving. So here we have a picture here of the starving times. They weren't able to get themselves going as a colony until John Smith arrives with some military backup to force them to begin to have a society in which they're growing food for each other and they're able to work with each other. But they're also getting a lot of help um, from the Native Americans in the area. Once it became very known for the Native Americans that Jamestown is not a trading post, the Porquois Native Americans began to realize that these new arrivals are going to spread into their territory and establish what happened was it created a war between the two groups. So at first it was a peaceful interaction between the Native Americans and the English, but eventually the war got very bloody and dangerous for both groups. So sustained immigration was vital for the settlement of these new colonies. Between 1607 and 1700, a little over 500,000 people left England. They settled in Ireland, West Indies, down here, and in North America, mostly around the Chesapeake Bay here. The majority of the settlers in North America were young, single men from the bottom rungs of society. If they can pay for their trip, they could establish themselves some land and they can grow some of the most important crop or profitable crop being tobacco. But tobacco was very labor intensive, and you couldn't make a profit unless you had a lot of land to use it and a lot of people to work for it. So one of their solutions was to bring people over with indentured servitude, meaning that those who could not afford the trip was paid for with their exchange of their labor from 5 to 7 years. Keep in mind that this labor actually meant the loss of your individual rights. The masters could whip you, they could abuse you for not working, they could determine your work hours. You had to pretty much endure the harsh living conditions of indentured servitude until their 7 years were up. And the fact that you can have land was not necessarily guaranteed, or money. So many indentured servants found themselves free after the 7 years, but were still at the bottom rungs of society. Few of them were able to establish their own tobacco land also. When more labor was needed, another source of labor they found conveniently was the African slaves from Africa brought by the Portuguese. At first, the African slaves were used as indentured servants and had the same type of rights and non-rights. If they worked 7 years, they were freed and could have their own land. Few of them did and were able to do that. Many of them found themselves free but with no land, and eventually laws had been changed to establish what we call permanent slavery among the group, as indentured servitude became less and less of a labor force for these early colonies. So eventually, these private companies were no longer being used. What happened was that the England itself and its government decided that they were going to charter the new colonies along the new North America colonies, meaning that the government took greater control over the properties that are being distributed. One of the places that they established or helped create was a place for Catholics to go to who felt there was too much conflict in England from the Protestants, and they arrived there in Maryland. Another interesting thing about some of the colonies, they were used to um, send some of their petty criminals or people in debt as indentured servants over to the New World. So England is now using the colonies for different purposes, either escaping religious persecution, finding new opportunities, in in um, in governing and or growing tobacco, or allowing themselves to be indentured servants. So these are the many reasons why people are moving over in this migration to the New World.